Last summer, I paid $148 for a bone and ribeye at a steakhouse in downtown Chicago. 3-week wait. A man at the door who takes your coat. My wife had one bite of it, set her fork down, and told me the steak I cook in the backyard is better. She was right, and I am going to prove it to you. Here is my claim, and I want you to hold me to it. By the end of this video, you will be able to cook a better steak in your own kitchen than any restaurant in this country can put in front of you. Not nearly as good, better, on a piece of beef that costs less than 1/10 of what they charge for it, using a pan you already own. 20 methods. Every one of them takes something away from a room that charges $148 and hands you back a plate. They're going to hate me for about 6 of them. Good. 31 years behind a meat counter is my whole credential. Nothing to buy at the end of this. Here's number one. Number one, cook it backwards. The order everybody uses is upside down, and it is the single reason most home steaks come out worse than restaurant steaks. The normal way is that you take a cold piece of beef, put it over a screaming fire, and stand there flipping while the outside chars and the inside creeps unevenly toward done. By the time the center gets where you want it, there is a thick gray band of overcooked meat sitting under the crust. You are judging doneness by poking it with a finger. Some nights you get it, plenty of nights you do not, and a $25 steak comes off the grate closer to leather than to dinner. Turn the whole thing around. Gentle heat first for the better part of an hour. The violent sear comes last and lasts about 90 seconds in total. On a smoker, 225. On a kettle, bank all your coals to one side and put the meat on the other side with the lid down. On a gas grill, one burner lit and the steak parked as far from it as it will go. In an oven, 250 on a wire rack. While it sits in that gentle heat, the meat comes up so slowly and so evenly that the center and the edges end up nearly identical, edge to edge, top to bottom. The gray band never forms because nothing was ever blasted, and it does not look impressive during this stage. It looks like a piece of meat sitting in a warm box. That is fine. Everything that matters is happening where you cannot see it. Every one of the 19 methods after this one hangs off this one. Get this right and the rest are refinements. Get this wrong and no refinement will save you. Number 2, 115. Write that number down because the moment you start cooking gently, you lose the ability to cook by feel. The window narrows and the meat stops giving you the signals you learned on. So you use a thermometer and you pull the steak off the low heat when it reads 115 degrees in the thickest part, not 125. Not when it feels about right, not when the timer says so. Why 115? Because the steak is not finished. The sear is still coming and the sear is violent. It will push the center up another 15 degrees or so and land you around 130, which is medium rare. If you want medium, pull at 120. The arithmetic does not change. The sear always takes its 15 degrees. An instant read thermometer costs less than one steak. It is the only tool on this entire list I am going to tell you to go and buy, and I would rather you bought that than a knife, a grill, or anything else in your kitchen. Here's the part that ought to sting. The consistency you are paying for in a restaurant is not talent, it is measurement. It is a man who cooks 400 steaks a week on the same equipment with the same timings and a probe in his apron pocket. You can have the measurement for $18. What you cannot have is the 400 a week, and with a thermometer in your hand, you do not need it. I have watched cooks with 30 years on them argue about doneness by feel and be wrong. The probe is never wrong. And number 3, salt it the night before, uncovered on a rack. This is the step almost everybody refuses to believe matters until they taste it once, and then they never stop doing it. And coarse salt, about 3/4 teaspoon a pound, every surface covered. Then the steak goes back into the refrigerator on a wire rack, uncovered overnight. Here is what happens while you sleep. For the first 10 minutes, the salt pulls moisture up out of the meat, which looks like exactly the thing you do not want. And that is why the myth about salting late refuses to die. Give it 30 or 40 minutes. That moisture dissolves the salt into a brine, and the brine gets drawn back into the meat, seasoning it from the inside instead of sitting on the outside like sand on a beach. Then the salt goes to work loosening some of the protein structure so the meat holds on to more of its own juice under heat. Meanwhile, and this is the half nobody talks about, the cold, dry air of the refrigerator is drying the surface. A wet steak cannot crust, it steams. That gray, blotchy exterior you get some nights where part of it browned and part of it just went beige, that is water fighting your fire and winning. Salt on the surface at the last second seasons the first millimeter of a steak. Salt the night before seasons the steak. A restaurant cannot do this. They are turning 300 covers, and they need meat portioned, stacked, and ready in a low boy, not spread across racks, taking up a night of cooler space. Their advantage is equipment. This particular advantage is yours, and it costs you a rack and 8 hours of doing absolutely nothing. Number 4, never let it come to room temperature. Every recipe on earth tells you to take the steak out an hour before you cook it. It is one of the most repeated instructions in all of cooking, and it is close to useless. An hour on the counter moves the center of a thick steak by a handful of degrees at most. Meat is a poor conductor. It does not warm through the way you imagine it does. What that hour actually accomplishes is undoing the surface, drying you spent all night achieving, and leaving raw beef sitting in a warm kitchen for no benefit. But there is a better reason than that, and it is the one that matters. The gap between a cold center and a screaming hot surface is your friend. That gap is the room you have to build a crust in before the middle catches up to you. Warm the middle, and you have narrowed your own window with your own hands. It goes straight from the cold to the fire every time. I have done it that way for 40 years, and I have never once stood there wishing the steak had been sitting on the counter first. And if you are cooking backwards, this matters twice over, because the whole method is built on managing that gap deliberately. You spend the low heat closing it gently, and then you want it wide open again for the sear, which brings me to the next one. And this is the trick for the night you did not plan ahead. Number 5, the freezer, 40 minutes on a rack. You forgot to salt it last night. It happens. Here is the closest thing to a cheat code on this list. Pat the steak dry, salt it, put it on a wire rack, and put the whole thing in the freezer, 30 to 45 minutes, not longer than an hour. Your freezer is the driest environment in your house by a wide margin. In 40 minutes, it will pull surface moisture off a steak far faster than the refrigerator can manage overnight. And because the time is short, the interior never freezes and never toughens. You take out a piece of beef with a dry, firm surface and a properly cold center, which is precisely the two things you want at the moment it meets heat. The surface goes slightly tacky to the touch. That is the sign. That tackiness is a crust waiting to happen. And while we are here, you can cook a steak from properly frozen, and it works far better than it has any right to, particularly cooking backwards. A frozen center gives you an even wider gap between the outside and the inside, which is more room to build crust in. It takes longer, and you season it after the sear instead of before, and it will never beat a night on a rack, but it beats a defrosted steak seared wet every single time. And it means a steak in the freezer is never an emergency. Nobody in a restaurant can do any of this. There is no room in a service for it, and no cook who would gamble on it. It is entirely a home advantage, and almost nobody at home uses it. Number 6, thick or do not bother. 1.5 inches at the absolute minimum. 2 inches is better. And this has nothing to do with appetite. A thin steak cannot be cooked well by anybody. Not by me, not by a restaurant, not by anybody living. There is no room in it for a gentle interior and an aggressive crust to exist at the same time. By the time the surface has browned properly, the whole thing is cooked through, and you get that gray band under the crust that most people think is simply what a steak looks like, because they have never eaten one without it. Look at what a serious steakhouse actually plates, well over an inch, frequently close to 2. That is not generosity, and it is not showing off. That is the only thickness at which the technique works, and they know it. The store cuts thin on purpose, and I help do it. So let me tell you why. A thin steak hits a price point a customer will pick up without thinking. $12 a package feels like a decision you make in 3 seconds. $32 a package does not, even when it is the better buy per pound. So here's the rule. Do not buy 2 thin steaks for 2 people. Buy one enormous one, cook it as a single piece, and slice it across the grain at the table to share. Same money, completely different dinner. And carving a thick steak at the table in front of people is worth something on its own. If you cut your own, 1.5 inches to 2, always. If somebody else is cutting, ask for it. They will do it, and nobody ever asks. Number 7, 2 zones. Never light the whole thing. Most people build one fire under the entire grate and then spend the whole cook fighting it. You cannot control heat you have nowhere to escape from. Bank every coal you have to one side of the kettle. Leave the other half completely empty. On gas, light one burner and leave the rest off. That is it. That is the whole setup, and it takes no equipment. Now you have somewhere to put the meat. The steak lives on the cold side with the lid down for the entire slow phase, and it only ever visits the hot side, and only at the very end, and only for 90 seconds. And here's the thing nobody tells you about a kettle. With the lid down and the coals banked, it is an oven, a genuinely good one. The convection running around the inside of that dome is remarkably even, and it holds a low temperature far better than people expect if you keep the vents small. Vents mostly closed on the bottom, mostly closed on top, and leave the lid alone. Every time you lift that lid to look, you dump the heat and you pull fresh oxygen through the coals and you spike your fire. Lifting the lid is not checking on it. Lifting the lid is changing it. The mistake I see most is a fire built too big at the start because it looks right. You do not want it to look right. You want it to look like almost nothing for 45 minutes, and then you want it to look like a forge for 90 seconds. Number 8, one chunk of oak. It is the only thing they cannot answer. A restaurant broiler is hotter than anything you will ever own. I will admit that plainly, and I will come back to it, but a broiler cannot make smoke. It has no way to. Neither can a pan, neither can an oven, neither can a salamander that runs at 1600 degrees. So use the one weapon in your yard that no professional kitchen in America can copy. Not a handful of wet chips in a foil packet. 1 or 2 fist-sized chunks of hardwood dry drop straight onto the coals at the start of the slow phase. Oak if you can get it, hickory if you like it stronger, fruit wood if you want it gentler. The entire 45 minutes, the steak is sitting on the cool side. Thin blue smoke is settling into the surface of the beef. Not a barbecue amount. You are not making brisket. Just enough that the flavor underneath the crust is something the person eating it cannot name and has never had on a plate they paid for. Watch the color of the smoke. Thin and blue and almost invisible is what you want. Thick and white and billowing means the wood is smoldering rather than burning, and that will make the steak bitter and taste like an ashtray. If it goes white, open your bottom vent slightly and let it clear. And this is the one method on the list where you are not catching up to a restaurant. You are going somewhere they cannot follow. Number 9, dry it with a towel at the last second. Everything you have done so far is about getting a dry surface. Do not lose it in the last 30 seconds. The steak comes off the low heat and sits while your pan gets hot. During that pause, moisture works its way back to the surface. It always does. It is not much, but it is enough to cost you. So right before the meat goes into the fat, take a paper towel and press it firmly over every face of that steak. Not a wipe, a press. Both sides, both long edges, the fat cap. Then it goes straight in. This takes 4 seconds, and it is the difference between a crust that forms in 45 seconds and a crust that takes 90 and never gets as dark. The reason is straightforward. Every drop of water on that surface has to be boiled off before browning can begin, and boiling it off costs you heat you wanted for browning. Water on the surface means the meat is steaming, and steam is the enemy of everything you are trying to do. Browning does not really get going until a surface is up above 300 degrees, and water sitting on that surface pins it at 212 until it is gone. A dry surface hits the pan and starts working immediately. A wet one negotiates with you first, and once it goes in, do not touch it, do not slide it, do not reposition it, do not lift a corner to have a look. You are breaking the contact that is doing the work. Number 10, sear it in beef fat and render the fat yourself, not olive oil, which burns and turns bitter long before a pan gets hot enough to matter, not butter, which does exactly the same thing faster. Rendered beef fat, tallow. And you do not buy it. You make it out of trim you were going to throw away. Every time you break down a piece of beef, there is a pile of hard fat left over. Cut it small, heavy pot, the lowest heat on your stove, a splash of water in the bottom so it does not catch early. 2 or 3 hours, barely stirred. Strain it into a jar. It sets up white and clean and keeps for months in the refrigerator. That jar cost you nothing. People sell it in little tubs at a price I am not going to say out loud. Tallow holds a heat that butter cannot hold. It does not turn bitter, and it does not smoke out your kitchen at the temperature you actually need. It fills every dip and hollow in the surface of the meat so the crust forms everywhere instead of in patches. And it lays beef flavor on top of beef flavor because you are searing beef in beef. What comes out is a crust I will put against any room in this country. Deep brown, crackling, and it tastes concentrated. And what is left behind in your strainer are crisp, salted brown bits that have never once made it as far as the table in my house. Number 11, cast iron and preheat it far longer than you think. If you are finishing indoors, it is cast iron, not stainless, not non-stick, and non-stick will not survive the temperature anyway. The reason is not that cast iron gets hotter. It is that cast iron does not care that you put a cold steak in it. A thin pan gives up its heat the instant meat lands. The surface temperature collapses, and now you are steaming instead of searing. A heavy pan has a reservoir of heat in the metal itself, and it holds the line, which means the preheat is the whole thing, and almost everybody rushes it. 6 to 8 minutes on high, not 2. The pan looks hot after 2 minutes, and it is not because the metal has not equalized yet. Give it 8 and it will be the same temperature all the way across. You will know it is ready when the tallow shimmers and just barely begins to smoke, not billowing, barely. And this is where I tell you the honest truth about restaurant equipment, because I would rather you heard it from me than found out disappointed. Those commercial infrared broilers are real, better than 1,000 degrees. Some of them get past 1,600 in under 2 minutes. Your oven tops out around 500 and no home grill is getting anywhere near 1,600 and you cannot match it. Stop trying to match it. But heat past a certain point is speed, not quality. Browning is browning. A properly heated cast iron pan does the same chemistry in 90 seconds that their equipment does in 40. Nobody has ever eaten a steak and been able to tell how fast the crust formed. Number 12, 90 seconds total and basted with a spoon the whole time. Steak goes in, 45 seconds, flip, 45 seconds. That is the entire sear. While it is in there, tilt the pan slightly so the fat pools at the low edge and spoon it continuously over the top of the steak. Do not stop. 10 or 12 spoonfuls in 45 seconds. 2 things are happening. You are cooking the top surface with hot fat while the bottom cooks against the metal, which nearly halves your total time in the pan. And you are running fat repeatedly across the surface, which browns it evenly instead of leaving the parts that did not sit flat against the pan pale. Stand back, it will spit at you. Long tongs and long sleeves. This is the moment for garlic and herbs if you want them, and only this moment, a smashed clove of garlic and a sprig of something woody dropped into the fat for the last 30 seconds will perfume the whole thing. Any earlier and the garlic burns black and turns the fat acrid. If you want the one embellishment I have never given up, it is this. When the steak comes out, drop a smashed clove into the remaining hot tallow, let it sit 30 seconds, and pour that over the sliced meat at the table. That is it. That is the entire sauce, and it beats anything anybody has ever brought me in a little silver pot. Number 13, stand it on its edge and render the fat cap. Here is the step 9 out of 10 people skip, and it is the one that separates a good steak from one somebody remembers. Every ribeye, every strip has a band of fat along one edge. If you cook the flat faces only, that band comes to the table white, soft, and unpleasant, and most people cut it off and leave it on the plate. That fat is the best flavor in the animal, and it is being thrown away because nobody cooked it. So after your 2 flat faces, take your tongs, stand the steak up on that fat edge, and hold it there 30 to 60 seconds. Lean it against the side of the pan. If it will not balance, watch it go from white to golden brown and start to bubble. Do the same on the other edges while you are at it. 10 seconds each. There are 6 sides on a thick steak, and most people cook 2 of them. What you get is a fat cap that eats like a crackling instead of like a piece of gristle. It is rendered, it is browned, it is crisp at the edge. This is also where a lot of the fat in your pan comes from if you did not have much tallow to start with. The steak fuels its own sear, and it costs you 30 seconds. That is the whole price of it. Number 14, pepper after, never before. Salt goes on the night before. Pepper does not go on until the steak is off the fire. Coarse black pepper burns. It scorches well below the temperature you need for a proper sear, and when it burns, it goes bitter and slightly dusty, and it sits on top of the beef instead of underneath it. That acrid edge people sometimes get on a heavily crusted steak and blame on the char is very often just burnt pepper. Grind it coarse and put it on after the sear while the surface is still hot and slick with fat. It will stick perfectly well, and it will taste like pepper, which is floral and sharp and a little citrusy rather than tasting like ash. If you want pepper flavor cooked into the meat, there is a way to do it that works. Crack it coarse, toast it briefly in a dry pan, and add it to the tallow for the final 30 seconds of the baste along with the garlic. The fat carries it onto the steak without ever putting it in direct contact with the metal. Now, I will be fair because the classic steakhouse method is salt and pepper both on before the fire, and plenty of very good cooks do it that way and always have. On a fast, hot sear of a thin steak, the pepper does not sit there long enough to do much harm, but we are searing in fat at high heat and basting for 45 seconds a side. Pepper does not survive that. Put it on afterwards. Number 15, never press it, never fork it, never cut it open to look. 3 habits, all of them common, all of them costing you the thing you just spent an hour building. Pressing down on a steak with a spatula does not make it cook faster and does not improve contact in any way that matters. What it does is squeeze juice out onto a hot surface where it instantly boils, which cools the pan and steams the meat. A fork puts holes in it. Every puncture is a channel for juice to leave through, and it will leave, and you will find it on the board instead of in the meat. Tongs only, always tongs. And cutting it open to check is the worst of the 3 because it is the one that feels responsible. You have a thermometer. The thermometer already told you. Cutting into it releases the juice and lets heat out of the center, and you cannot put either one back. The habit underneath all 3 is fiddling. Most home cooks handle a steak 4 or 5 times more than it needs. Turn it once during the sear, stand it on its edge, and otherwise leave it alone. Watch a professional cook on a broiler station. The steak barely moves. He is not managing the meat. He is managing the heat, and he lets the meat sit in it. That is what all this is really about. You are not cooking the steak. You are arranging conditions and then getting out of the way. Number 16, the rest goes in the middle, not at the end. Every television chef for 30 years has told you to rest the meat when it comes off the fire so the juices go back in. When people have actually tested that, weighing what comes out of rested steaks against unrested ones, the difference turns out to be a good deal smaller than the confidence with which everybody repeats it. And when you cook backwards, the rest belongs somewhere else entirely. And the steak comes off the low heat at 115, and then it sits on the counter for 5 or 10 minutes while you bring your pan up to temperature. That pause is doing two jobs at once. The surface dries further, which buys you a better crust, and the interior settles and evens out, which is the actual work a rest is supposed to do. Then it goes into the fat for 90 seconds. And when it comes out, you can slice it almost immediately, 2 or 3 minutes at most. The slow cook already did what a long rest is for, which means the steak reaches the table hot, with the crust still crackling audibly under the knife. Ask yourself when you last had that in a restaurant. There is a pass and a heat lamp and a walk across a dining room and a plate that has been sitting in a window. That crust has been going soft for 4 minutes before it ever reaches you, and there is nothing anybody in that building can do about it. Yours has been sitting for none. That is not a small thing. That may be the largest single advantage on this entire list. Number 17, throw the marinade away. I am going to be blunt, and I have earned the right to be blunt about this one. And a marinade does not reach the center of a steak. It never has. I have cut open marinated steaks with a knife and looked at the cross section more than once out of stubbornness, and you can see exactly how far it got, a few millimeters on a thick steak after a full night, a few millimeters. What a marinade does do is put water and sugar and acid on the surface of your beef, which is the precise opposite of what you spent this whole video establishing. Water fights your crust. Sugar burns before the meat browns. Acid denatures the outer layer of protein, and if you leave it long enough, turns it chalky and slightly mushy. The reason people believe in marinades is that they mostly use them on thin, cheap cuts, cooked fast, where a few millimeters is a decent fraction of the whole thing. On skirt or flank cut thin, a marinade is a reasonable idea. On a 2-inch steak, it is decoration and damage. Salt reaches the center. Salt is a small ion and it travels. That is the entire reason dry brining works and marinating does not. If you want flavor on the outside, put it there at the end in fat where it will not burn. Garlic in the tallow, herbs in the baste, pepper after, flaked salt on the sliced surface. That is the honest position, and I will hold it against anybody. Number 18, baking soda on the cheap cuts. Now, the cheap cuts, because that is where I actually live, and this is the one that makes people laugh at me and then telephone me a week later. Take a tough cut, chuck, flank, round, skirt, anything from a hard-working part of the animal, and toss it with about 3/4 of a teaspoon of baking soda a pound. 15 or 20 minutes if it is sliced thin. Up to an hour if it is thicker. Then rinse it thoroughly under cold water and pat it bone dry. Meat is naturally slightly acidic. Baking soda is alkaline and it raises the pH at the surface, and at that higher pH, the muscle proteins cannot bond as tightly to one another. When heat hits them, they stay loose instead of seizing up and wringing out their own moisture. Softer texture, more juice, and it happens in minutes rather than in the hours. A marinade wastes doing nothing. That is not something somebody made up on the internet. That is the mechanism behind velveting, which Chinese kitchens have used for a very long time. And it is exactly why the beef in a good stir fry is tender when the identical cut out of your own pan is not. 2 rules, and they both matter. Rinse it properly, or it will taste faintly of soap. And do not use it on a good steak because the tender cut does not need help and you will only push it toward mush. Understand what this does. It takes the thing you are told has to be paid for, tenderness, and makes it a technique. That is the whole premium in a steakhouse menu, right there undone with a box from the baking aisle. Number 19, Koji, and 45 days of flavor in 2. This is the most useful thing on this list that I did not learn in the trade. I learned it late from a much younger man, and I have used it every month since. Koji is a mold that Japanese kitchens have used for centuries to make miso, soy sauce, and sake. It grows on rice. The rice is sold dried, and you can buy a bag of it without much trouble now. Its enzymes break protein down. That is the whole job it does. Grind the rice to a powder, rub it all over the steak, wire rack, refrigerator uncovered, 48 hours, then rinse it off, pat it dry, and cook it exactly the way I have described. What comes out is not identical to a 45-day dry-aged steak, and anybody telling you it is identical is selling something. But it is remarkably close, nutty, deep, savory, with a sweetness underneath it on a piece of beef that was completely ordinary 2 days ago. It tenderizes considerably as well, which means it is at its best on the cheaper cuts and can actually go too far on the expensive ones. 2 days, not 4. Now think about what that does to a menu. Dry aging is the single biggest number on any steakhouse list in this country, and it is expensive for real reasons. A dedicated room, weeks of time, refrigeration and airflow, and a genuine loss of weight and trim at the end of it, which somebody has to pay for, and that somebody is you. 2 days in a bag of rice gets a home cook most of the way there. That is the one they will hate the most. I am fairly certain of it. Number 20, read the grain before your knife touches it. The last one costs nothing, takes no equipment, and rescues every cheap cut in the animal. A muscle is a bundle of long fibers all running one direction. Cut along those fibers and you hand somebody a mouthful of long, tough strings to chew through. Cut across them and you have already done most of the chewing for them with the knife. On a tender cut, it makes a modest difference. On the cheap cuts, the shoulder, the flank, the skirt, the sirloin, it is the entire difference between a good steak and a bad one. It is why most people think those cuts are tough. They are not tough. They were cut wrong, and nobody ever told them. So before your knife goes anywhere near it, look at the surface. You can see the direction plainly on a rested steak. Turn the meat so the blade runs across the fibers, and go on the bias if the piece is thin, so you get a wider face on each slice. And here is the butcher's version of the same idea, which almost nobody knows. When you portion a whole sirloin cap into steaks, you deliberately cut it with the grain. It feels wrong. You do it on purpose so that when each cooked steak reaches the board, slicing it the natural way is automatically across the grain. That is not a cooking trick. That is butchery. And thinking 2 cuts ahead like that is most of what 31 years actually taught me. Let me give you all 20 in one breath. Cook it backwards, gentle heat first, pull at 115 with a thermometer, salt the night before uncovered on a rack, straight from the cold, never room temperature, freezer for 40 minutes on the nights you did not plan, thick, 1.5 inches minimum, 1 big steak instead of 2 small ones, 2 zones, never the whole grate, 1 chunk of oak on the coals, press it dry with a towel at the last second, sear and tallow you rendered yourself, cast iron, preheated 8 minutes, 45 seconds aside, basting the whole time. Stand it on its fat edge for a minute. Pepper after, never before. No pressing, no forks, no cutting to look. Rest in the middle, not at the end. Throw the marinade away. Baking soda for the tough cuts. Koji for 2 days. And read the grain before you cut. That is everything I know that costs a restaurant money. The first Sunday I cooked this way for a table of people, a man asked me which butcher had sold me prime. It came off a shoulder at $6 a pound. He did not believe me until I brought the bag out of the bin and put it on the table. And that is really the point of all of it. The cattle herd in this country is the smallest it has been since the early 1950s. Fewer animals, higher prices, and no fast way out because a cow is not a line you can speed up. What I watched from behind the glass over 3 decades is that Sunday steak became birthday steak, and then for a good many families, birthday steak became nothing at all. They did not announce it. They simply began walking past the counter, and I knew their names, and I watched them do it. Here is what nobody tells them. The ribeye, the strip, and the tenderloin together are about 8% of the animal. 8. That is what everybody fights over and what goes on every menu in America. You have not been priced out of beef. You have been priced out of 8% of an animal and then told the 8% was the whole thing. Every method I just gave you works better on the other 92. So tell me in the comments where you are watching from And tell me which number on this list you had never heard before. I want to know which ones actually travel, because I have been arguing about some of these for 40 years. And if somebody older than you taught you something about fire or meat that is not written down anywhere, put that down there too. Those are the ones I read twice. Next time, I am going to show you how to dry age beef properly in the refrigerator you already own. No cabinet, no fan, no bag, nothing to buy. It is the thing that carries the biggest number on any steakhouse menu in this country. There is exactly one mistake that will spoil the whole piece and cost you $60, and I will show you that mistake before I show you anything else.